Hello and welcome to TSG Forum's latest webinar, IUCLID for Plant Protection, the story so far. My name is Gareth Marshall. I'm a senior consultant at TSG Consulting and I will be your moderator for today. I'm very pleased to announce this event is hosted in collaboration with CropLife Europe and the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. As such, we have two presentations running approximately 1 hour, concluding with a 20-minute Q&A. CropLife Europe shall open the webinar, offering up an industry perspective on the implementation of IUCLID to date, drawing on first-hand experience and some of the challenges faced when preparing member submissions. We'll then go on to hear from EFSA, who will provide an overview of the new IUCLID arrangements, touching on some of the common issues encountered during the first and second waves of IUCLID applications. On behalf of TSG Forum, I would like to thank today's speakers and all attendees joining us today. All participants will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar. However, please take the opportunity to submit your questions to the panel. These will not be made visible to all, though we do our very best to answer as many as possible within the time available. The webinar shall be recorded and will be available after the event. Okay, and so to start proceedings, I would like to welcome our first speakers from CropLife Europe. Katja Tim, Mark Tyvis, Andrew White. Katja leads the submission management team within Bayer AG, Division Crop Science, Regulatory Science, taking care of processes and tools to facilitate the preparation and submission of regulatory dossiers. Katja currently chairs CropLife Europe's Electronic Submission Expert Group, the eSEG. Mark leads the submission management team within BASF SE, Agricultural Products, Regulatory Science, responsible for the dossier processes and tools globally, including IUCLID. He has been the CLE representative in the IUCLID pilot and the former chair of the eSEG. Andrew is a global regulatory manager within Adama Limited. He participates in both eSEG co-chair and CPRPT forums at CropLife Europe. In addition, he's an industry representative for IUCLID within EFSA's Pesticide Steering Network subgroup. And with that, I would like to now hand over to Katja for our first presentation of today. Thank you, Katja.
Thank you, and a very warm welcome from my side. What we would like to do today, and I'm hoping for the slide to move to the next one. Hopefully now it works. Trying to go to the next slide, which doesn't seem to be working. Here we go. So what we would like today is to share our view as industry or applicants on how to deal with IUCLID for pesticide submissions. We will not provide any specific advice on how to exactly use IUCLID or troubleshooting and so on, because that is clearly in EFSA's or ECHA's remit. But what we would like to do today is on a high level, share the experience that we have made as CropLife Europe member companies with IUCLID for pesticide active substances and maximum residue level dossiers, because we think it's important to share the experience to make you as applicants aware of the additional time and effort needed to prepare your dossiers in IUCLID. And we would also like to point you to some key aspects that we struggled with or otherwise feel they are important, so that you can ask important questions when preparing your dossiers for submission. We would also like to make you aware of CropLife Europe's IUCLID integration platform. We have developed a few tools to avoid unnecessary copy and paste work and make your life a bit easier when filling IUCLID. And ultimately, we would then also like to share some thoughts on IUCLID going forward. So, trying to move to the next slide again. Perfect. So just to make sure that we are all on the same page regarding IUCLID, some background information here. So IUCLID is not only used for pesticides, but already widely used as a submission standard in chemical industry, say, be it for REACH or biocides or CLP. And it's also adopted in jurisdictions outside the EU. It has become mandatory for any new EU level evaluation of pesticide active substances and maximum residue level applications after the 27th March 2021, meaning in the course of the entry into force of the transparency regulation. IUCLID requires OECD harmonized templates, in short OHTs, as a reporting format, and they are typically developed based on input of numerous experts from various organizations and are then ultimately updated and approved via the OECD's IUCLID panel. Again, trying to move to the next slide. Here we go. So some basic principles of IUCLID and what's different compared to the dossiers we submitted previously. So IUCLID is clearly substance specific. And within IUCLID, the entries must be created for each substance which is contained within the submission. So the active substance and also each metabolite, each coformulant, and each impurity has their own distinct data set. And these data sets, and Jane will talk about it further later on, are then combined at the mixture level. And these mixture data sets have their own data requirements and corresponding table of contents. So basically, we are combining substance data and add the plant protection product data and create the dossier from the mixture data set. And these data sets are reusable, so they should not be named by data point and they should not be duplicated so that they can be reused later on. Trying to go to the next slide. So just to give a little overview of the last month and years working on IUCLID. So to test the feasibility of IUCLID for pesticide submissions, EFSA initiated a pilot starting in September 2019. And that was based on the transfer of a dossier of an old active substance, clodinafop, from a conventional CADI dossier PDF formats into IUCLID. And a technical group comprising members of EFSA, ECHA, EU Commission, several member states, and also us as industry, provided feedback on what worked well in IUCLID and where we still saw some aspects for improvement. And after this pilot feedback, our feedback as industry was, first of all, that we really highly appreciated the fact that EFSA member states engaged with us in the discussions and took our view as applicants into account. Still, unfortunately, we saw several important issues in IUCLID that still needed to be addressed in order for IUCLID to be really fit for purpose for pesticide submissions. In February 2020, a decision was taken to use IUCLID as a submission format for pesticides under the transparency regulation, and a minimum viable product of IUCLID was implemented and is still being used, of course, for submissions. And in order to deal with that, we realized as industry that really a significant resources are required, and it's very important to really plan ahead. So just to give one example, the clodinafop pilot, there it took 800 hours and even more of work to transfer this dossier into IUCLID, even though the entries were limited because per data point, only one study summary was transferred. So the real workload of doing a dossier in IUCLID is, from our experience, more than double. And also it's important, if you want to give this work to consultants, to consider that they have limited capacity. So it's really essential to do an early planning way before the work starts. Another important aspect is that new IUCLID versions are released biannually. So data is then migrated from a previous version to a new version. And so this means that there is continuously rework and review of the dossiers required to ensure they are also fit for purpose in the current format. And with that, I hand over to Mark for further insights on key aspects in IUCLID.
Yeah, thank you, Katja. And also from my side, a warm welcome to the audience to hear a bit about our first experience with this paradigm change, moving from a document-based representation of our data for regulatory purpose to a more data-centric representation in the IUCLID system. So I'm going to focus now on the next few slides on a few key aspects which everybody submitting under the IUCLID regime should bear in mind when preparing for such a submissions. Yeah. First of all, it's important in the IUCLID management to note that there is a difference between data sets and dossiers within the IUCLID system. So data sets are always live and can always be edited by the user who has a right to do so. So it can continually be updated. And dossiers, which you create out of the data set coming from a mixture, as Katja explains, are read-only. So they are representing a frozen view of the data at a certain time point where you prepared the dossier itself. Yeah. This may lead to some issues which I wanted to highlight. So if you have parallel dossiers coming from the same source of a substance data set, for instance, a renewal and an MRL, you may have significant issues to see within the data set what was sent where or when it was changed and so on. So this is something very important to bear in mind. Also, intrinsically, it must be bared in mind that the data may be updated continuously by the users you have in the system. So some discipline has to be there to ensure everything stays between the different submission steps. Of course, Euclid, with all the different instances which may exist in your in-house world, working together with CROs or so on, the information can be exchanged between the different Euclid instances. So you can import and export via the intrinsic format IUCLID, for instance, within a task force or between an applicant and consultant. But it's important to take into account before you start such action a few things. Yeah? Multiple versions, for instance, of the same information you can work on in parallel. But later on, you cannot combine Euclid documents which have been worked on in parallel to one document. There is no merge function within the Euclid system. You can, after re-importing a data set which has been worked on externally, you can have several settings upon import to override or not override, but not to merge. So this has to be taken in account before such action is started. Also, and that's our experience with the first large data set, you must imagine in IUCLID, you not only have the data itself in a structured way, OHTs and so forth, but you also have a lot of attachments in there, in essence, the study reports itself. So this means the resulting IUCLID files upon import export may be quite big, exceeding the gigabyte limit. So in the end of the day, it may happen that this import-export of large file takes long, can take several hours to import into an IUCLID instance, and it may cause errors. So you may need several attempts to get that running. Yeah? And of course, if Euclid also allows to export if your version and the consultant's version or partner's version is out of synchronization, so they are in a different version of IUCLID, you may need to export to major previous version. But of course, upon re-import into the target IUCLID in the newest version, data are migrated and they may be changed or altered, leaving things empty. So that leads to a significant amount of rework in the end. Yeah. Also, we see a need to, it has to also be mentioned that at this point, this is much more complex. Some of you may be familiar with working in Euclid under REACH, but due to the linking of all the substances together and due to the fact of the many attachments in the plant protection dossier in IUCLID, these things are, these issues increase when working under the plant protection regime. Also, you have to bear in mind the access right and the Euclid user administration. So if you import-export between consultant and applicant, it is not advisable to rely on an external IUCLID instance only. You should have, each and every applicant should have their own IUCLID instance. And due to size limitations within the cloud-based solutions, it should be a server version, because you will not be able to handle all your data generated over time within a cloud-based solution. Just getting too many data and the cloud limit is exceeded. Also, if you then go into your IUCLID, you can define access rights per data entity within the system, via user rights and certain roles to be defined. If you want to limit access to a certain substance for a user group to a certain substance only, there is an instant-based security system available within the user management. But this will require a significant administrative workload for a unit administering that IUCLID to make it work properly and sufficiently for the IUCLID users who are supposed to work then only on a certain substance and the rest of the users not to see it. So personal experience within my company is we do not use it because it's too complex to run it. So move to the next slide. That works. Then also very important and a key aspect upon or before submission is the dossier validation. IUCLID has a validation assistant within there, which validates the dossier upon the defined working contracts, so the target of your submission, and that requires significant technical and administrative steps to be taken, in addition to the current scientific admissibility steps. So it computationally validates your IUCLID dossier prior to submission and also upon submission within the ECHA portal. There are submission blocking rules which will hinder the submission to the portal in the end. And there's a lot of quality rules implemented which give quality warnings in your instance and within the portal. And yeah, our first experience is that it is expected that they are all addressed or justified upon admissibility check by the RMS or EMS, depending on the regulatory process you are advising. Also, it has to be noted that, of course, there is a constant evolution of the validation rules currently ongoing. The first ones in the 6.5 IUCLID used up to October, end of October this year, have been further refined. With the next version, new rules have come into place. This will, of course, continue. Maybe Jane will allude a bit to that later. But of course, this may create issues because upon a new release, there is maybe new blocking business rules. And in this very case, in this year, it meant that a renewal dossier created in IUCLID 6.5.15 on the 26th of October could not be submitted immediately after the release of IUCLID 6.6.2 on the 27th of October. There was new fields created in the dossier header and validated. It's all correct like it is validated, but of course you could not anticipate this if you are still running on 6.5 version. In addition, formal changes and other changes to the IUCLID can cause issues with the validation rules, which you already passed upon a previous submission of a dossier. So after release, some rework and additional justification will be required to pass the validation check once more, or if you have a dossier to be submitted shortly after the release of a new IUCLID version, significant rework will be required to pass the validation rules. So in CropLife Europe's experience, we feel that a transitional phase would be required for any submissions shortly after a new version release to overcome these issues. Just to display that, I've taken a partial screenshot from our own IUCLID down here below. And that's a dossier which was submitted in 6.5 and then migrated to 6.6. And yeah, it was submitted with 0 submission check rules, 0 quality check rules before, and after the release we found, yeah, you can add it up, more than 900 problems, so to call, with the IUCLID dossier caused by an enhancement of the rules and caused by an enhancement of the system itself. And none of these could have been fixed prior to the release. That's also important to know. now I want to move the slides. Here we are. Another key aspect of that is the confidentiality claims and steps to be taken to ensure confidentiality under the General Data Protection Regulation as well as under CBI, according to Article 63 of 1107. So within a IUCLID system, you can set several flags applying to certain sets of data field or dependent data field. And all these flags set must be justified to pass the admissibility of the confidentiality check in a Euclid text box. This is displayed below. Yeah, you can see it here with the set flags and the justification box below. In addition, a rule set is applied to the IUCLID dossier upon filtering for publication. So some information which is always confidential, e.g. author names, e.g. contact information of a private person, are removed by default by a rule. That's very good. Of course, there's also a lot of information which cannot be claimed confidential and is always published by default. For instance, the legal entity submitting the dossier reflecting the actual applicant. Of course, this is fully in line with the underlying regulation. Yeah. The flagging is, of course, at a text box or at a data field level where it can be applied. So specific words or phrases within a study summary, the study summary results, for instance, end up in a big free text field, reflecting a bit what was in the previous OECD summaries. So within that text box, you cannot apply confidentiality to any specific words or phrases within there. For instance, if you list in a tabular overview all the authors of the studies and things like that, what was a quite common thing within an OECD dossier too. So this must be bear in mind that this cannot be filtered out using the IUCLID software. And also important for procedural view on the confidentiality aspects, after admissibility, the dossiers are proactively published by default. The confidentiality review performed by EFSA or the RMS, depending on the process you are in, is a second step coming after that first proactive publication of the dossier. Another problem which is currently faced is that there is a filtered dossier dissemination preview is available in IUCLID since IUCLID 6.5. That is very convenient because you can then see the effects on your filtering of your filtering within your IUCLID instance yourself. However, at the moment, care must be taken in addition to look into the Zenodo part of the knowledge junction for any new published filtering rule set, which EFSA implemented outside of a version release, and pre-check the potential impact of those. So currently, the rules applied within Euclid 6.6.2 are different than the ones EFSA will apply within their instance before publishing the dossier. The rules are published, they are available on Knowledge Junction or via Knowledge Junction. So read that carefully and take a close look on the potential impacts on your submission prior to submission. Good, and having said that, I would like to hand over to my dear colleague Andy to continue with the aspects of the submission portal.
Thanks, Mark. As we all know, we are now in the IUCLID regime and the paradigm shift. And so, can we go back a slide? Okay, I've got it. So as Mark alluded to, these dossiers are orders of magnitude larger than was previously done under REACH, and we are currently seeing the average size of a renewal dossier to be around 4 gigabytes. Within the EFSA IUCLID submission portal as it stands today, this cannot be achieved by an import by the applicant, and it requires an additional step of contacting EFSA so that they can upload on your behalf via an SFTP platform. You would need to book a slot for this, and this slot in general is a week or two prior to the mandated submission deadline, and which obviously further shortens the time frame available to applicants for submission. Another point to note for this is should you wish for a consultant to submit on your behalf, they will require access to your legal entity and submission user rights to enable this. And with permission granted of that, they will have access to your submission platform to have an overview of everything that you have submitted via that legal entity as it stands today. Dossiers after admissibility are published, and this is in an EFSA version of IUCLID, which pretty much mirrors the cloud or the server version of IUCLID that you can see, and so is slightly different from the HTML representation for REACH dossiers, and this can be officially accessed by the Open EFSA platform. These dossiers are read-only and cannot be manipulated, but obviously, as per the transparency regulation, non-confidential versions of each and every attachment, so all of your studies or Excel spreadsheets that you have submitted, can be downloaded from that IUCLID instance. It remains to be said that several dossiers have been so far published via the Open EFSA platform in the EFSA version of IUCLID. But many of these, I believe all but one, were subsequently removed at one time or another due to GDPR privacy claims by the applicants for which personal data was visible, which was not foreseen at time of submission. Obviously, there is a shared responsibility between the applicant, the RMS, and EFSA for this, and such that the applicant should actually check using the dissemination filtered dossier preview thoroughly prior to the submission. So from available information to date, EFSA acknowledged that this was a massive paradigm shift, and so initiated the Hypercare initiative to assist early applicants, those with renewal dossiers in the July and August timeframe. The Hypercare consisted of an MS Teams channel, which I believe had around 400 attendees or nominations, both from industry and member states. And this also consisted of bi-weekly meetings showing IUCLID features, the format and the tools available to both applicants and member states, and the type of information for some of the subject areas that EFSA would like to see included in the study summaries. This was obviously welcomed by industry and provided a wealth of information, but as of last month has now closed, and the MS Teams channel has turned to read only, and so no more questions can be submitted via this route. So with regards to the information presented in the presentations, it was comprehensive for some areas. The MRL sessions were very informative and well done, but others subject areas had limited information to be gained. So as Mark rightly said, published material can be accessed by the EFSA application toolkit, and this is generally a pathway to either Zenodo or Knowledge Junction, but there is no RSS feed or anything for these updates, and they are quite regularly updated on an ad hoc basis, and so must manually be checked. And a number of the supporting materials are available, such as the active substance user manual, etc. These are in prescriptive tabular form, detailing the type, detailing the contents in an IUCLID specific way, rather than the type of information that the EFSA would like to see in each of the text boxes. And it must be noted that for the active substance manual in particular, this is currently out of synchronization and refers to IUCLID 6.5, where since the end of October, we are now in the IUCLID 6.6 realm. Moving forward, the only input now for PPP-specific IUCLID support and conversations is the subgroup of the EFSA PSN on IUCLID. This is met once in October, and there's another scheduled meeting for January 2022, and has Member State, Commission, EFSA, ECHA, and industry participation. So CLE, IBMA, and ECHA each have 2 nominations, and fruitful discussions on how we can move forward with IUCLID to make it more fit for purpose and mature for PPP submissions. In addition, on a more general basis, ECHA obviously hosts IUCLID forums on IUCLID in general, which obviously covers the other regulations, and the OECD OHT group also have reviews on a more general level. And additional points to consider, IUCLID includes MetaPath and DAR composers for metabolism, and these are now required to be inserted into the IUCLID platform for your active substances. The current versions of these are not particularly user-friendly and can be error-prone, and are quite time-consuming to complete. And obviously, as it stands today, our experts believe that they lack some essential functionality. IUCLID has specific tools, such as the dissemination preview that was mentioned previously. These can assist the applicant and the RMS, but are still currently in infancy, and we'd like to see some progression on these. So there is a reporting function to get PDF or rich text fields and reports out of IUCLID. These are aligned to the classical OECD DocM and DocN documents, but as it stands today, these are insufficient and have significant errors in rendering large tables. And so we have also been requested in a number of instances the classical EU summary dossiers in parallel, which obviously leads to a duplication of efforts. Tabular entry is currently cumbersome and time-consuming. We will move on to the IIP tool on the next slide, but for instance, for a number of fields such as PECs, you need to enter data on a cell-by-cell level rather than a copy and paste type input. There is a light dossier approach where you can export only the dossier updates from the previous version. Obviously, this is welcome. And we note that with regards to the public IUCLID instance, quite in-depth knowledge of IUCLID is required to find any of the contents, and so might hinder public involvement. And so with regards to the IUCLID integration platform, a lot of manual effort can be taken away by its use. And so if you have in-house repositories in a structured format containing, let's say, literature metadata fields, etc., you can prepare these in a CSV format specified by the integration platform and pass this information directly into your IUCLID server version. Obviously, this currently works for literature references and reference substances, and as of recently, tabular data is also available where you can not do it in a prescribed cell-by-cell level, but copy and paste tabular data from Excel or those sort of programs, and then send them to your IUCLID instance. With this can be viewed and seen and downloaded at the below URL. and it's not particularly moving forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so for the long-term functionality of IUCLID with such large data sets is unknown. When we're putting gigabytes upon gigabytes into our server versions, we are not quite sure if IUCLID could handle it in the future. And then obviously, as continually stated, migration to newer versions leads to you continually reworking your data sets for dossiers submitted. And on occasion, you need to be careful of the latest guidance and manuals. But as it stands today, in some instances, there is not a clear overview of the changes. With regards to the dossiers that have been published and then subsequently removed, obviously CLE have significant concerns regarding confidentiality and the risk of unforeseen personal data and CVI to be disclosed. And in general, we recognize that this is a minimum viable product, but further improvements to study summaries are required to produce high quality dossiers such that they can be assessed by member states. And with that, the use of IUCLID to date has not actually been used for PPP evaluation processes. All of the work so far has been to try and put as much information as possible into IUCLID and not to look at how it could be used by RMS for evaluation. But having said that, EFSA so far have obviously been very responsive and generally supportive through all of the forums that were available and still are available, and in general are aware of the significant challenges in this transitional phase. And with that, CropLife Europe would like to thank you for your attention.
Well, many thanks to Katja, Mark, and Andrew for the informative presentation. That's much appreciated. Just before moving forward, I'd just like to remind the audience to submit questions ahead of the Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit them as the presentations proceed. And with that, okay, so let's move on to our second presentation of the day, and I'm very pleased to welcome Jane Richardson of EFSA. Jane is the lead scientist for open data and the product manager for IUCLID at the European Food Safety Authority. Since 2019, Jane has been responsible for the implementation of IUCLID for pesticides and the EFSA transparency regulation. And so over to you, please, Jane.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to try and give you an overview of the key things that you need to think about when preparing a submission via IUCLID, and go through the current recommendations that are in place to help you have a successful submission. I will also discuss a little bit about some of the future activities and also about the governance of IUCLID, both at the pesticides level and internationally. Okay, first of all, I just tried to explain some of the key components of the transparency regulation, because you'll find that many of the changes and many of the requests that we make from you are to ensure that we can meet those requirements. I'd also draw your attention to a guidance document on the submission of pesticide dossiers from the administrative perspective, which is an important read when planning your submissions. So first of all, EFSA receives applications for authorizations and studies, but most importantly, before we receive dossiers, studies should already be notified to EFSA, and this is the so-called Notification of Studies database. Once the submission is made, we have to publish a sanitized version of the dossier, so immediately after the admissibility check. Then, as the next phase, there is the confidentiality check, and in this case, you may be contacted to revise, for example, some areas which you may have considered to be confidential, and this then results in a second publication of the dossier.
And this publication is then used for the public consultation. And the public consultation and the publication is one of the key parts of the transparency regulation, as this ensures that the European citizens can be aware of the type of information that's used in the risk assessment and how the risk assessment is performed. So once the consultation is complete, EFSA carries out the risk assessment, and then this is published. And also there would be another publication of the dossier, the one finally used in the assessment. So our IUCLID format, as I'm sure you're all aware, there is a number of pieces of legislation that were put in place to support the transparency regulation, and there are specific requirements for pesticides that the submission should be in IUCLID format, and this is to meet the standardized data format requirement of the transparency regulation. So submissions must be in IUCLID format and submitted via the submission portal. The IUCLID documents must be completed and the attachments indicated in the manuals must be included. So what should be your first step? We really recommend that you read the documentation. I saw already in the chat that there are some questions about how people missed out of the hypercare project can get access to the knowledge and expertise. This is by going to what we call the applicant's toolkit, and the link is on the slide. When you go in there, you'll find materials that we developed during hypercare and where we took on board things that we discovered during hypercare. So you have access to news, manuals, crosswalks, training material, filtering rules, and any other resources that you need. So please go here and read the documentation to get started. The transparency regulation also foresees the possibility to request pre-submission advice. Now, so far, maybe people are not aware, but there has not been much uptake of this possibility, and I would strongly recommend that you take advantage of this. So if you have questions about how to prepare a dossier, by doing a pre-submission advice request, you can have an online meeting and we can go over your questions and concerns. So the link at the top will take you to how you request pre-submission advice, and there's also a short video tutorial explaining more about pre-submission advice. So this is, I would say, a positive aspect of the transparency regulation, so please take advantage of it. Next up, you need to set up your IUCLID instance. We recommend two types. If you're doing these smaller dossiers under 1 GB, so definitely MRL submissions and basic substance applications, but also some smaller substance dossiers can be used. It includes a very nice proceed to submission button, which means that you don't even need to import or export a dossier. You can simply pass it straight through to the submission portal. And also the cloud services are updated regularly, so you don't need to worry about making sure that you're on the right version. For those people producing the larger dossiers, then IUCLID 6 server, as indicated by CropLife Europe, is obviously the best selection. It supports multiple users and is recommended for active substance applications. However, we'd like to draw attention to checking on the IUCLID 6 website. Here you can get the latest versions for downloads, but there are also full release notes with every version. So if you want to know that what's changed, this is the documentation you need to read. Next up, specifically for renewals, you need to plan your task force. So the regulation says that as far as possible, joint submissions should be made. So this means that you potentially need to work with people in other companies when preparing a submission. So we recommend two mechanisms for doing this. First is the use of a third-party consultant to manage the exchange of confidential material. In this case, we would expect the submission of a single dossier, and the third-party consultant can make use of templates to assert information to specific legal entities. And post-submission, you can use the advanced export option to provide separate versions of the dossier for each applicant. If a third-party consultant is not used, then you will be looking to have a lead applicant. In this case, the lead applicant must submit the main dossier, which should contain all the studies to be evaluated. And then the other members of the task force may submit what we've labelled a supplementary member dossier, but I think the confidential identity dossier is the popular term. And this should only contain confidential material. So that's our recommendation for the task force. We also require you to provide this information in the dossier header. This was one of the changes that we had to make, but we need this information to ensure that the different types of dossiers can be processed effectively. In addition, it is really important that you remember to include your active substance information, and reference substance for the active substance should ideally be shared by all members of a task force. So once you've got your group together, the next step is obviously to select the working context. As indicated by CropLife Europe, we always start from a mixture. There are 4 different submission types, which range in complexity from the basic substance application to the EU PPP active substance application. But there are, for example, common data sets that are used across dossiers. And one example of this is the EU PPP other substance data set, which, for example, can be used for metabolites or impurities. And this is actually shared in the 3 larger working contexts. So once you've selected the correct working context, you then need to group the studies by data set. And as previously explained, you always start from a mixture. So we have the mixture, the main mixture. A new feature that was added in 6.6 is other mixture, representative mixture data set, and this allows to report multiple representative products. The substance data set is obviously where you report the active substance, and you can see that the 2 data set types are defined by whether they are from 284/2013 or 283/2013. So the table of contents more or less matches the data requirements. In addition, you need to consider what is the test material. So if the test material is the parent substance, then you report that in the parent data set. Obviously, in the case of metabolites, if you have metabolites, again, if the test material is a metabolite, it's the metabolite data set. In case there is a mixture between parent and metabolite, then the parent data set should be used. And if there is a mixture of metabolites, the predominant compound data set should be used. It may seem a little complex to have to put all of these studies under specific data sets, but it facilitates reuse of these data sets, not only again in other PPP submissions, but also within the international regulatory community of people who are using IUCLID. It's also important to complete all IUCLID documents. There are a range of different document types, so I'll just take you briefly through that. The dossier header is the administrative information, and most importantly, the information that you provide here affects the processing of the dossier. In particular, different validation assistant rules are applied depending on the dossier header. You also need to link in here the legal entity and the contact person. Then we have the endpoint study records, and these are the classic OECD harmonized templates for OECD guideline studies. So these must be completed. And in addition, they contain 2 entities, which is the literature reference, which is where full study reports should be placed, and the test material. Then you have summaries. Summaries are used to create a conclusion based on a number of endpoint study records submitted. And then in addition, we also have flexible records which cover information that's not strictly linked to experimental studies. So for example, a gap document or the composition of the active substance, again, these should be completed. And then we also have the flexible summaries, which deal with aspects that are more related to the risk assessment. So, for example, calculations of dietary exposure. The next important thing when you start to complete the individual IUCLID documents is to make sure that you pay attention to make your confidentiality requests. So you can see an image of the flagging system that's applied in IUCLID. There's some pretty key things to remember. First, to use the flag in the administrative section of the document or the section, to indicate a request for confidential information. If you set the flag, you need to complete the justification. So you can see that in the picture below. Reference must be made to the legal basis under which the request is made. So there are a number of different legal bases for confidentiality, which are described in the transparency regulation, and you need to select the correct legal basis to match the claim that you're making. And you need to pay attention to flags, for example, in entities. So generally the flagging works at the level that you see it. So if you claim in the document, it will apply to information in the document. If you claim a row in a table, it will apply to a row in a table. And if you claim in an entity, it will apply to the fields in that entity. So reference substance is definitely one you need to take care of. And you can find more details on this in the practical arrangements. The link is provided. Then attachments. Obviously, a long-term goal with the IUCLID system would be to reduce the number of attachments. But currently we still have a large number of attachments, and therefore these instructions should be followed carefully. The full study report and other related files should be provided in the literature reference entity. A file for publication should always be provided. We have to publish the dossiers, and therefore you need to provide a sanitized document. So you provide that document in the attached sanitized document for publication. If the file contains, if you have also confidential material in that file, the original file needs to be put into the attached confidential document. For published literature, so for example, papers taken from a literature search, if the copyright is not owned or it's not, for example, an open access journal, then you need to provide a bibliographic citation in the attached sanitized document for publication. Okay, this is quite an important one, and this was a specific request by the European Commission to ensure that the public at least can be aware of what type of information is being used in this section. It's strongly recommended to use a compression algorithm on your attachments before uploading this. This will reduce your file size and make your work much easier. The Adobe compressed file feature, for example, can be used. And also to check the EFSA manual for required attachments. So for example, the MSS Composer and the Primo files. So you can see a picture here. And you will also see that we have some notification of studies information in the literature reference entity. So for notification of studies, obviously you need to have already notified your studies before the submission. So as soon as you're commissioning studies, we would recommend that you register them in the notification of studies database. And then when you're completing the dossier, you need to provide some additional information. So first of all, before you can notify, you will have to get a pre-application ID. So you need to report any pre-application IDs that you have associated to the substance in the dossier header. And if there are studies that you have notified but are not provided in the dossier, you should also justify that there. Within the legal entity where you have a study in the dossier, you can add a row to the other study identifiers and report your notification of studies ID. And this information will then be checked upon submission. And again, there is a link which provides more information on how to do notification of studies. Validation assistant is a key way to check that your dossier is in good shape before you make it a submission. So before submission, run the validation assessment to make sure things are technically complete. It's important to resolve all validation warnings. If you cannot, you can rerun, once you have resolved those rules that you can, then you can rerun validation assistant and just provide a justification in the Excel file for those rules you were not able to solve and provide this to the RMS. And if you do this part, this should make your admissibility check quicker and more efficient. There has been, as reported by CropLife Europe, some issues with the validation assistant at present. Most of those have already been resolved in the cloud, and it's planned that there will be a February release of IUCLID, which will contain the updated validation assistant and also the one amended rule for filtering. So please pay attention for an early February release. Another key tool that you can use in IUCLID is Report Generator. You can see the list of reports that we've provided in the October release. So this covers all the sections for document M, plus things like a gap report, an NOS extraction, that's notification of studies, confidentiality report, etc. We do release updates to these rules. We do provide updates to Report Generator, and these can be downloaded from Knowledge Junction, and these can be imported into your local instance if you're using local instances. However, there has been some indication that the RMS have been asking for separate versions of DocM. So we're already working through the OECD IUCLID Customization Forum to improve the reports used in Report Generator. So if you are, for example, a keen coder working in the pesticides industry and would like to contribute to this, or if you're a person who's frustrated by having to produce more than one DocM, please join this community because then we can really make sure that the DocM documents are sufficient and reduce this requirement for submitting additional information when the information is already provided in the IUCLID dossier. And we would also like to remind you that it's important really to ensure at all cases that the reports that we generate from evaluation and assessment reports that are generated should be in alignment with the published dossiers that have been viewed by the public. This is a key part of the transparency regulation, and Report Generator is an easy way to achieve this. So hopefully that by this point our dossier is more or less complete and built. The next step is, which we strongly recommend, is filtered and dissemination preview. So before submission, create your dossier. You will need it anyway for the next submission step. Use the view, report and create filtered dossier feature. And when you do this, you will receive what we call the dissemination preview report, which is an Excel file. So take this file and you can filter, for example, by the different sensitive documents that you're concerned about, and you can check and see whether something will be published or not published. You can, as part of this, you will also receive a filtered dossier, and you can use a visual inspection to support this. But we do recommend also using the dissemination preview, as this means that you can use a more structured approach to checking and ensuring that your confidential material is maintained. And then as a final bonus, if you run Report Generator on a filtered dossier, you actually create a sanitized report. So this is another way to simplify and speed up your work. However, we'd like to raise a few key points for attention when using dissemination preview and the filtering function. So in general, the rules that we have in place are reasonably simple. A field is either published, not published, or published if there has been a claim using the flag as described in the previous slides. So if we take a few worked examples, as mentioned, the legal entity is published, but the contact person and the manufacturing site location is not published. But for the information in the method of manufacture document, you need to use the confidentiality claim. Or, for example, the attached standardized document for publication is always published, but the attached document is not published. However, even in the not published parts, there may still be a requirement to make a confidentiality request. So if you have a document that contains a study report, for example, that contains confidential material, you will need to claim and justify this. It's not just sufficient to provide a sanitized document. I would also like to draw your attention to one particular area here, which is the data sets linked to components in the mixture composition. There's a picture shown on the slide. We have had to amend one filtering rule since the 6.6 release, and this was because the mixture composition document also controls the linking of the data sets. So the filtering that was initially applied actually removed entirely certain data sets, and within those data sets there were studies. As you're aware, we published the dossier so that during the public consultation, at least a sanitized version of the study information is available to the general public. So this change was actually contrary to the transparency regulation. So we had to make that change back again. So this means that your data sets will be shown, and it also means that you need to pay attention to put flags in the right place. So if you don't want your substance identity shown, you need to put a flag in the reference substance. If you don't want substance information, you need to put a flag into the substance. And then obviously, when you're filtering in this document specifically, it is only impacting the information in the row. So whether the typical concentration, for example, is redacted. But this also means that you do need to pay attention to those studies that are linked in the data sets, as they will be subject to the confidentiality claims of those studies themselves. So just to be clear about that, that's one of the key areas we recommend that you pay attention to. So assuming that it seems that all the confidentiality claims are in place, we're most probably ready now to submit a dossier. So there are two mechanisms. For the small dossiers, if you're working in the cloud services, you can either use the proceed to submission, or if you do have it exported, you can use the submission portal. But it's a very simple process, everything automated. The main thing important is that you need to check the submission report. As indicated, there are some rules applied in the submission portal, which you can fail. So you need to check to make sure that your submission was successful. And this is your responsibility to ensure. Until March 2022, we have a specific process for the large dossier. This is the end of March. You need to book a submission with EFSA, and we will arrange for you to do a transfer via the SFTP server. This is largely because of issues with the virus checker. And then you will receive a link to the submission portal, which you can use to make the submission. And again, it's also important in your case that you check the submission report. So currently these are split until March 2022. After March 2022, you should be able to export a dossier and then submit directly via the submission portal. However, we'd just like to flag a key area for third-party consultants, and it's really essential that you make sure you are a foreign entity with a submission portal manager role for the submitting legal entity in the dossier header, okay? So basically, because you're submitting on behalf of the dossier owner, you need to be acting as the submission portal manager of the legal entity of the dossier owner. So please make sure that you do that, and that will make your submission straightforward. Resubmission. So once a dossier is submitted, do not make any further submissions unless requested by the RMS or EFSA. We have seen that there are some applicants who are making a submission by the deadline, but the dossier is not complete, and then are making additional submissions to provide more documents, for example, within the dossier. Please don't do it. Make sure that you have completed your dossier fully first, and then respond to the update request by the RMS or EFSA. If an update is requested, these are the recommendations. So for dossiers prepared in IUCLID services, you can use the simple proceed to submission feature, and that will transfer you via the submission portal. For dossiers prepared, for example, in IUCLID server, we recommend here you need to do an export before you can send it to the submission portal, and we recommend to use the light dossier feature. The light dossier feature, there is instructions and a manual at the link on the screen, but basically what it does is the XML component of the dossier is maintained, but only the updated attachments are included in the light dossier export. So this results in a significantly smaller file size, and it's much easier to manage and submit. So we definitely recommend that you use that technique. So once your dossier has been submitted and is in the agency IUCLID and available to both EFSA and the RMS, you can start to track your submission through OpenEFSA. So OpenEFSA is the key point to see the status of an assessment, so you can track where your dossier is in the system. It provides a link to the public IUCLID instance where the public can review the dossier studies, etc. You can also click and request pre-submission advice through here. And then, for example, other requirements of the transparency regulation, such as information on the people performing the assessment and public consultations, can also be accessed through this portal. Next steps for IUCLID. We need to make an update to the working context for microorganisms. This is because the data requirements have been revised, and they're just, I think, at the point of being formally agreed. And this means that EFSA will need to make a change to the working context to ensure alignment. This will involve certainly some redesign of the table of contents, but we may also need to develop a couple of new documents which are more suitable for microorganisms. And in particular, this would be in the area of environmental occurrence. And in this case, we would most probably make use of EPA test guidelines, as there are no formal test guidelines at the OECD level for biopesticides. And the new working context should be available in October 2022. Then, as indicated also by CropLife Europe, having structured data in a standardized format allows us to take advantage of interoperability and data reuse, and they're already producing some useful tools. From the EFSA perspective, we're actually looking to migrate some of our own databases into IUCLID format using the data uploader. So this is a simple desktop tool that can be used to migrate historical data into IUCLID format, and you can pick this up on the the IUCLID 6 website. IUCLID already exposes a public API, which I think is the one that CropLife Europe is already using. We're exploring the use of this for exchanging confidentiality claims with EFSA systems, but also looking at ways where we're using phrase lists from other organisations, for example, EPA, and whether we can update those automatically. And also the API or a plugin is already used by the QSAR toolbox, and this seems like that this would be also a suitable mechanism to reuse IUCLID data, for example, in MetaPath and also in the planned Primo 4 update tool, which will be updated. And in addition, also there is the data extractor, which can be used to extract IUCLID data. And there we're looking at this in relation to the Ruedis database, which VFR already operates, with plans to extend access to this information to the RMS. In addition, as explained by Andy, we have not done so much work in the evaluation phase. So there are a couple of activities that we would like to do to improve IUCLID for evaluation. One of the key ways is a mechanism by which, for example, an endpoint summary, since we receive dossiers which cannot be edited, there needs to be a mechanism by which the evaluator can record a summary where the endpoint differs from that provided by the applicant. So this is something that we're working on and is under analysis with ECHA. Also, we'd like to look at how we can automate certain steps of the assessment and evaluation using some of the tools that we have available. So resubmission, in particular annotations, and capturing the input from evaluation in annotations so that they could be combined using report generator to produce evaluation or assessment reports. And this is another area that we are focusing on to support the evaluation work. And then finally, all of these activities feed into a higher level concept which was defined in the chemical sustainability strategy. So the chemical strategy focuses particularly on one substance, one assessment, and how we can start to reuse information that has been submitted in assessments taken under different parts of the regulation. So you can see an early schematic of plans for this common open data platform on chemicals, which is foreseen in the chemical sustainability strategy. And you will see that IUCLID is a very large box in this, this plan, and therefore IUCLID is really becoming a core component of how the European agencies can work together on the assessment of hazards in chemicals. And finally, governance. So we have two forms of governance. We have the PSN, which is the Pesticide Steering Network subgroup. And this is designed to predominantly focus on the PPP format and also features. So this is the area where we will be discussing, and we already provide information on plan changes to filtering rules, validation assistant rules, formats, etc. So please make sure that you keep in contact with the industry representatives on the PSN, because one part of their role is also to disseminate the information from this particular subgroup. So if you want to give input to improvements, please give them to the nominated members of the PSN of your industry association, but also make sure that you ask them to tell you and update you of what's going on in IUCLID or what is planned. And then beyond that, we also have the OECD IUCLID user group. So IUCLID is now being used internationally by a number of different regulators. This can be very beneficial because it means that although there is quite some work in preparing a pesticides dossier for Europe, you can potentially use that in other jurisdictions. And I think in this way that most probably does have some serious benefits. So again, it's important, I think, to also engage with the OECD group, which is open to the OECD member countries. In particular, the IUCLID release schedule is always discussed here. The planned features in IUCLID are discussed, and also the OECD has a governance role on the updates to the OHTs, and summaries are planned to also be included. So there are two areas where you can contribute and give feedback, and there are two areas where you need to pay attention, as there will be information coming out of these groups which is important for you. And I think that's the last slide.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. It's much appreciated. And we're running over scheduled time, so I'd just like to bring this part of the webinar to closure and with some concluding remarks, or rather take-home messages. The first being that timing really is of the essence, and applicants should allow ample time to prepare and compile their electronic submissions. For new actives and renewal dossiers, one might feasibly expect up to a year's preparation, if not more, ahead of submission, and the resource required to construct a dossier really is significant. Applicants should be aware and take advantage of the resource library at their disposal, which is facilitated and maintained by EFSA. This includes IUCLID manuals, FAQs, filter rules, crosswalks, and so on, but also targeted presentations. I think it's fair to say the implementation has been somewhat challenging for all concerned in industry and during 2021, and that includes member state authorities not specifically represented here today. However, through continued industry, member states and EFSA engagement, it is hoped that the PPP IUCLID platform will evolve and become more streamlined through user feedback and periodic upgrades. And so with that, I'd like now to open the Q&A. As I say, we've run over slightly, and so if the speakers are happy, we can answer at least a few questions and remain perhaps 5 minutes beyond 20 past. Okay, so if you'd like to join me on the panel. Okay, thank you very much. And so dealing with the first question. How long does a confidentiality check typically take? And I would ask that to Jane.
So for this one, I think this is one where I would have to pass this to my legal colleague, so we can respond in writing to this one. Did you see if Simone is in the meeting?
No, it's okay, Jane. We can take that one offline.
It's available in the practical arrangements. It really depends on who the authority is dealing with the review of them, whether it's the RMS or EFSA. So it depends on the application type. I believe EFSA have 10 weeks and the RMS have 4, and then need to revert back to EFSA for any clarifications. But check the practical arrangements.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to the next one. I'll read this line for line. So my understanding is that IUCLID files can be used to transfer data within separate data sets between companies, with the receiving company then able to use the copied data from function to include data in the final data set. This is not a merge button, but performs a very similar function. Please could you confirm? I guess I'll throw that one out to CLE, Mark.
Yeah, I can shortly answer that. Yes, I fully confirm that this is a useful way of collaboration over different Euclid instances. Yeah, my intention was to highlight that this is one way of doing it. There are certain other ways, but it needs to be aligned up front before getting started. That's important, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Moving on to the next one. Again, I'll read this line for line. We saw in a previous EFSA presentation that the justification box for confidentiality flags should not be completed for PPP, and instead the confidentiality report generator should be used. That seems to be different to the advice Mark provided in the presentation. Please could you clarify how the justification box should be used or not for PPP? And again, I'll throw that one out to the CLE, perhaps again, Mark.
Yes, for sure. I think there's a little misunderstanding here. You have to fill the justification boxes under the CBI flagging within IUCLID to enable the confidentiality report to run. This confidentiality report is filled from the justification boxes and the set flags within the IUCLID system. So the one is the precondition to have the confidentiality assessment report out of IUCLID. Maybe
Okay.
you can confirm that, because I think that's the way of doing it.
Yes, exactly. So in the EFSA presentation, you need to fill in the confidentiality boxes if you flag. And then using the report generator, we can extract all of the different sections where they have a confidentiality claim. So also, if you want to check your claim, you've used a reasonably consistent approach, you can also use the confidentiality report to get an overview of where you've claimed and what you've claimed.
Thank you very much, Jane.
I must say, to add to what Jane just said, it's really helping if you want to get an overview about your claims after you prepared them all in IUCLID. It's really helpful because this report can be filtered and sorted and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the next one. Someone in the audience would like clarity on the statement dossier published after admissibility. Confidential review is a second step. Question being, surely the review of confidential information has to take place before the dossier is disclosed. Jane, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, it's just contrary to the transparency regulation. The transparency regulation requires that the dossier is published as soon as possible. So we provide a small, the RMS or EFSA provides a small technical check on the dossier to make sure that it is reasonably complete. Then we need to publish it, and then the confidentiality assessment starts. So yes, it's all described in the transparency regulation. Okay,
well, thanks for signposting that. I'm sure that a lot of the audience are keen to know the answer to the next question, but is there any option of the hypercare being extended, or revisited, something similar in the future, to perhaps aid those that were less privileged, shall I say, and not involved in the initial hypercare?
Well, I think I would just like to highlight one of my early slides where I really point that you have the opportunity to ask for pre-submission advice. So hypercare was something that we put together to get people started. And as I said, most of the input from hypercare is already available in many of the training materials that we provide. But if you really want the opportunity to ask a series of questions with EFSA in preparation for your submission, then pre-submission advice is the best route to do that. Also, please also make sure that your representatives on the PSN subgroup regularly update you on the latest discussions in that group, because that's also the other way that we wish to cascade out that information.
Indeed, and yeah, thank you for noting that. Okay, moving on, there's one here questioning whether and when IUCLID will be implemented for product evaluations, or Article 43 renewal and new products under 33. Is that something that might be on the horizon? I don't know if you can comment on that, Jane.
I can say that the topic is being discussed. I don't know that there's any full agreement yet, but for example, I have a meeting on this topic on Friday, the discussion with DG Santé to see which would be the best approach here, also in conjunction with discussion about the use of the PPP-AMS system.
Okay, thank you.
So on that point, that would require a legislative change, which obviously member states would need to vote for. And so this next phase of the evaluation process and looking at the feasibility of IUCLID is therefore very important for that.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, just looking for the next. So I have one here. Apart from those lucky enough to have been able to benefit from the Hypercare program, will there be more troubleshooting support made available for applicants? As currently the Q&As, EFSA manual, PAs, etc., are all out of date. Example being the new 6.6 release of IUCLID. Now, for example, there are CPI only options for confidentiality flags. Previously, I believe there was no PA, intellectual property, and so on. So just to comment that it's causing some difficulty keeping up to date on the information that's available. Jane, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think we already covered this to a large extent on the will Hypercare be restarted? Obviously, the answer is no. But we're currently working on the manuals, which should be published either just at the end of December or beginning of January. So new manuals will be out. We've also explained some of the mechanisms by which you can get support from us. And in particular, I saw some questions about Knowledge Junction. So just to be clear that Knowledge Junction is an open repository that we use basically to publish resources that can be useful for any area in food and feed safety risk assessment. So much of the open data that we publish is published through there. So you can find large pesticide monitoring data sets, for example, if you're interested in that type of thing. But we also publish protocols, tools, models. It's really a big resource and somewhere that we recommend that people look if they're planning or searching for material to support the risk assessment in food and feed. And in there, we also publish a large number of the IUCLID materials that we have to make that easily accessible and publicly available.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. I think we've got time for one more question, and so many thanks for the useful presentation. Where should EDWOE assessments, Appendix 1 and API, be included? Endpoint or flexible records?
The answer would be both. If you have studies that are linked to tests to demonstrate endocrine disruption, for example, then there are some specific OHTs that you can use. But in terms of Appendix E, we have a specific document now, an IUCLID document that replaces Appendix E, and you should complete that. And it's in, off the top of my head, I would guess 6.8 of the top section. It's certainly in the lower end of the top section in the IUCLID manual. So if you check the crosswalks, another tool that we highly recommend, which helps to map, in fact, check the crosswalks anyway, because you might find some other documents that you need to complete. This provides a mapping from the old KCA, KCP structure to the current IUCLID TOC, and it indicates which documents you should complete. That's also available from the applicant's toolkit and was updated this week, Andy, so that's one that we already updated.
It's just to complete it under 5.8 of the active substance or BBP working context section. Yeah.
Well done, Mark. Thank you.
Yes, and information, Jane. It would have been nice to have the 6.5 to 6.6 talk as well, but yeah.
Okay, when I get more stuff, I'll come back to you.
Things moving around. KCA is nice, but dossiers that were already prepared under 6.5 to find out where things have gone.
But I think
Okay.
it's red now, Randy, where the changes are.
Helen?
So you should be able to see it reasonably well, I think. But anyway.
It took Mark and I think, about an hour to realise that the ED hadn't disappeared because it moves.
Ah, okay.
Okay, well, thank you to the audience for the questions, most appreciated, and of course our speakers. I'd also like to thank Forum for hosting the event, and just to note that whilst we have run over, we'll do our very best to answer those questions that we couldn't get to on the live event. So we'll follow up separately. So yeah, a big thank you again to CropLife Europe and EFSA, most appreciated, and we will now close the webinar. Thank you.